Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director of our Medical Business Line here at Intertech. And today I am joined by George Strom from our Connected World and Cybersecurity team. So George, thank you so much for joining me.
This is awesome to be here, Clarissa. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, absolutely. So maybe to kick us off, you can give a little bit of an introduction to yourself and how you got into the cybersecurity connected world business here at Intertech.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started with Intertech in 1995, and I'm always very proud of the fact that, I know I've been here a long time. I started when I was 3 years old. But no, in all truthfully, I was in the employee number range of about 7,000. And over the past, 25 years, we've evolved as our clients' demands have evolved via organic growth and also acquisitive growth. And about 6 years ago, we bought 3 different product cybersecurity companies that really opened up our eyes to what clients would be needing with the growth of the Internet of Things. And that was a tremendous opportunity. So I raised my hand to volunteer to bridge the gap between our electrical clients and the connected world and begin to learn how to understand what their speak was. It's not the traditional speak that I grew up with, but also how to bring our clients to the forefront of these new challenges with their products.
Yeah, it's something that seems to be such a, really hot topic over the last, as you say, right, 5, 10, 15 years of people moving to this smart, connected, how do you incorporate this type of technology into devices? And really just something that, as consumers and as people who are out there living our day-to-day lives, right, we're just inundated with this all the time, right? Everything's becoming smart since the iPhone era, right? Everything is at the touch of a button at our fingertips. And we see really all industries kind of moving in this direction.
Yeah, it's been the growth factor has really come down to with the medical devices, the demand for data, the demand for new patient data, immediate patient data, how to best diagnose and quickly diagnose and properly diagnose, the patient. And I think there's some great case studies out there where, the average hospital bed has about 10 to 15 different connected devices to it. Represents a bunch of engineering challenges, let alone cybersecurity, but also, could something in that environment, very controlled environment, represent risk? And then, 3 years ago, we had the pandemic where we had non-traditional, home healthcare products being introduced to the home for a multitude of reasons. One, you weren't allowed into a hospital, so they're bringing, traditional hospital equipment into the home environment, which represents a lot of challenges when you think about all the different smart products that are sitting in someone's home. They could absolutely springboard into your device or your mobile app and wreak havoc with the end patient.
Yeah, it's almost like all these different new areas can become patient environments without being controlled patient environments, right? So
that's correct.
You're taking care of yourself in your own home, right? A lot more responsibility for your own healthcare. And then that introduces all of these additional risks, especially from a cyber perspective, right? And it's not just patient data information or your personal information, but can get even further to things like, well, what happens if there's a cyber threat and something happens to the device or technology itself?
Yeah, and one of the challenges, and when I bring this conversation to the table with a lot of our clients, they don't consider the fact that, when you're in your home environment, you have a home assistant that can tell you the temperature or play a song for you. Obviously we all have those home assistants, but now with voice activated, if someone could replicate the voice of the patient who's talking to theoretically their device, they could wreak a lot of havoc. So it's very dangerous, to have a smart lock that has voice activation, but now you have the potential for a smart medical product that potentially could have voice activation, which could lead to a lot of problems.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So, if I'm a medical device manufacturer and I'm thinking about, okay, I'm moving towards this connected space, towards a smart space, integrating some type of technology, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, radio, where do I start, right? Like, where do I begin when I'm looking at it from a cyber perspective?
That is probably the primary question almost every device manufacturer asks is, where do I start? And the challenge is every device manufacturer is a different part of their cybersecurity journey. So there is no right or wrong answer. However, I always say, if you haven't done a vulnerability assessment, and if you don't know if your device is susceptible to a penetration or a hack style test, that's a great cornerstone, because then you understand what's in your software, what vulnerabilities may be in your software. And then, if that vulnerability becomes a threat level, that's when the criminals are trying to get into that device. So I always say start with the basics, vulnerability assessment and a penetration test.
So how does the vulnerability assessment really work? Okay, so I'm deciding I'm ready to move forward. I want to do a vulnerability assessment. What does that mean to me as a manufacturer? What do I have to provide? How does this kind of work?
Well, It really works by understanding what you have in your software libraries. Obviously you have an operating system, and then you may have some device drivers that are sitting on top of that, whether that be Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, to be determined by the end device manufacturer. But then the bigger risk is when they're starting to leverage open source libraries that are out there to help you compile your software. We see a lot of challenges with mobile applications where the device manufacturer is subcontracting the development of mobile application to someone third party to them, and they may not be forthwith in what is in that mobile application. Mm-hmm. So then you're in that vulnerability, disclosure. You have vulnerabilities in your software. It's not necessarily a bad thing. When they're identified, they're compared to what's called the NIST database, is what we leverage at Intertek. And then the manufacturer has to understand when those vulnerabilities become a threat level. That's when somebody could wreak havoc.
So then is my goal to have zero vulnerabilities? Like what do you, are you ever going to get to that spot where it's like, oh, great, we've designed this so well that there's absolutely no vulnerabilities and we're good to go?
That might be fanciful. It might be fanciful to think you'd have no vulnerabilities. However, even with the FDA latest release on April 8th with their pre-market requirements or recommendations, I should say, they are advocating that the device manufacturer actually disclose the vulnerabilities in their pre-market submission, because you do have vulnerabilities that may be needed for the functionality of the device or the features of the device, and you have to make sure you have hardening around that vulnerability so it is not exploitable. And from there, you're looking at all the vulnerabilities, and the scenario is almost a risk-based approach it's turning to in cybersecurity. What would happen if the device was hacked? What would be the risk to the patient? Could the patient be at harm if we're attacked? So that's where you have.
No, I was just going to say, so then, you do your vulnerability assessment, and then you also mentioned doing some level of penetration testing. So what does penetration testing actually entail? Do I send a device somewhere and have someone try to hack into it? How does that actually work?
Yeah, what we do at Intertek is ethical hacking. So we're not trying to do it. It's white hat hacking. There's a difference, right? There's obviously nefarious hacking where they try to get in and do something very criminal based. But with ethical hacking, we would understand where the data resides, whether it be the cloud or a backend server. We're looking at if you have a mobile application, if it's operating in Android or iOS, and try to get through those new threat vectors onto your device. So we're trying to understand what happens when it's authenticated, what happens when, and then try to see if we, as a hacking community, we can get in, or our employees can get in to shut down the device. We did have a surgical device in our laboratory. We actually were able to hack into their mobile application and shut down the surgical device when it was actually operating. And that's the risk factor, right? Yeah. So then you're saying, wow, what happens if somebody who's on the operating table and that medical device got hacked, by somebody that's in the hospital, maybe not a hospital employee, could just be someone visiting someone, or someone just wants to do something, evil. They could actually hack that device. So that's the risk factor.
Right. So it really is taking our minds outside of just the risk of patient data, risk of personal information from a cyber threat, and now moving into something that could be potentially very harmful, right? If someone's able to hack into a product itself.
Absolutely. It's just, it's traditionally in my tenure at Intertek, we were always taught when I first came on board, risk of shock, risk of fire, risk of mechanical hazard for electrical safety. Now we're saying risk of cybersecurity. So here's your fourth risk that you have to know as a device manufacturer.
Yeah. And I think, medical device manufacturers in general are used to the idea of this risk-based approach, right? What's your level of risk that you're willing to tolerate as a manufacturer, and are used to thinking in that mindset. But I do think it's a new kind of shift to be looking at it, not just from the safety perspective, the EMC perspective, but as you say right now, incorporating that, what are the cyber risks as well, right? As a manufacturer, you have to kind of look at it from all of these different ways. So one of the areas where we see, and you kind of touched on it briefly, right? We see medical device manufacturers taking their products to the FDA, right? Going through the 510K process or another type of submission process. So you said the FDA released a new guidance document back in April. So are there things that we should be looking out for as manufacturer, right? With this new guidance, with what the FDA is looking for?
Yeah, it's a fundamental shift, in my opinion, on what they're asking for. And they're trying, the recommendations are aligning with 21 CFR 820, which is good manufacturing practices, and having your design finalized, and then having a process for your software, everything down to the development lifecycle of the software, and then having a very iterative approach towards your testing, so that systematically you're going back and looking at your device to see if it could be hacked throughout the lifecycle of the device, all the way, cradle to grave. But it comes with concept all the way through submission. So then they equally then They want to see with your submission, not just the front end, tell me the vulnerabilities you have, tell me if it could be hacked, tell me what type of software, who manufactured it, the version, the year.
Wow.
All absolutely, it's a fundamental shift. Equally, one thing I find intriguing is they're advocating for having a separate risk management file, ISO 14971 document that's wholly dedicated towards cybersecurity, which then dovetails into a document called TIR 57. And that's really where you have the implications. What happens when you're hacked? What's the potential harm for the patient? So, a highly risk-based approach and a fundamental process to get to that risk-based approach, all the way through your post-market surveillance and having your vulnerability policy reviewed, so you understand, what happens. How do I patch? What happens when I'm hacked? Et cetera, et cetera. How long does it take me to, administer the patching and, an annual vulnerability assessment?
Right. And I think it's so interesting, too, when you see this kind of stance that the FDA has taken. Obviously, this means that they're seeing so many more products with connected elements involved, right? And they do consider this to be a big risk, right? Because of the level of scrutiny and additional requirements that they're putting on this. This is something I think that we'll likely see, right, only to continue to evolve and change as technologies changes, as things get smarter, more connected, systems get more connected, that we'll likely see more and more requirements coming out of people like the FDA.
Yeah, I think that what we've seen is a couple things as well. Up prior to April 8th, there was a very straightforward recommendation I would provide to clients that they should go and ask the FDA, what I should do for testing. And the two areas that we always saw our clients getting, you have to do A and B was one was connection to the cloud, because they're very nervous about data in the cloud. Is it susceptible to being attacked? And two was USB ports, which is really interesting because a lot of clients don't think about the USB ports as being, a threat vector.
Yeah.
But that's where, if you have the ability to have video on your device, could somebody start watching Netflix on your device and insert something that shouldn't be there? The device should not recognize that USB stick and not operate when that rogue USB stick goes in. So that's really where they're very persnickety over those two items. But then the third one that happened probably just around the beginning of April was the need for a third-party penetration test. Well, they're not saying you must have third-party penetration tests. I think they see it as a nice to have rather than a need to have. But they really look for that objective evidence that you have the ability to, has your device been put through its rigors. So and the understanding is not every client has the staffing or the tools to do the actual testing. That's why they're advocating for a third party.
Yeah, and I think
loosely advocating for a third party.
Yeah, loosely advocating, right? I think you make a really good point and suggestion, right? That you're always still welcome to then go and talk directly, as you said, your recommendation early on, right? Talk directly to the FDA, talk directly to the notified bodies or whatever agency you might be going to, because based on the risk factor of your product, based on what you're doing, they may want to see different things or have different requirements that they'd like to see. Yeah,
the European Union has a bit of a different slant than the FDA too, right? The European Union, in both for the medical device regulation and for the IVDR, in their Annex 1 essential requirements, they've documented what are required process and procedure. And under the verification and validation, that's where they look at the actual risk of the product. And the risk of the product, if you're wireless, they would consider that higher risk. And if you don't have wireless, they consider it moderate risk. So they've tailored their risk based on how the device is configured. However, that being stated, that the out clause is if you have state of the art, right? They always want the manufacturers to make sure they're state of the art, and that really dovetails into where you're parking your data. Is it a backend server or the cloud, right? So then that comes back into play. And the best practices that we leverage for testing for cloud and mobile applications, we use what's called OWASP, OWASP, as supplemental testing for device manufacturers. Yeah. So you mentioned the MDR and the IVDR, but obviously with Europe too, we also have the RED with the Red Directive. So there are some cybersecurity requirements in that. How do those two kind of relate to each other if you are producing a medical device or an IVD device versus going through the RED? The RED is a really interesting document that they've, the article 3.3 paragraphs D, E, and F. However, it does not specifically state medical devices. Okay. And if you read through those three paragraphs, you will see, compared to the essential requirements in the MDR Annex 1 and the IVDR, you will supersede the Red Directive. Got it. Okay. Yeah. Equally, there's a new draft standard, and I'm drawing a blank on the standard in the European Union specific for medical devices, which would be great when it's published. Then the medical device community can say, I need to do this standard for cybersecurity. And that particular standard is loosely based on the IEC 62443 standard,
Okay.
Which has long been a standard for industrial automation.
Got it. And so one thing I wanted to kind of go back to too, when you're talking about the FDA, because one of the things that we saw is they're now referencing this bill of materials for software. So can you maybe go into that a little bit? Because I know we're used to on the hardware side, right? When you put together a bill of materials and everything you need to include, but what is the FDA talking about when they want you to have this software bomb?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always use the analogy of the Lego bricks, right? If you have children, you know how to build with Legos, or if you've ever played with Legos. But when you start with the base level, you're looking at your operating system, and they want to know the version of the operating system, the year it was manufactured, the revision, and then you go down to your device drivers. And device drivers are really intriguing because many people may have Bluetooth on their device, but they don't understand the nature of having it backwards compatible, where your device may be Bluetooth X, but will it log on to other Bluetooth networks out there that are Bluetooth 4, Bluetooth 3, whatever it may be? So you have to look at that as an issue as well. Then you get down to your open source libraries. And again, you're compiling all the information on the open source libraries you're using, everything from the year it was manufactured, down to the revision, et cetera, all the way up to your proprietary software. And that really becomes the cornerstone of your tech file, if you would, from the cybersecurity perspective.
Understood. Yeah, understood. So if I'm planning for long-term, right, how often should I be thinking about retesting as a medical device for security, right? Because, typically we think about testing from a safety perspective or an EMC perspective, or when clinical trials, right, you're not doing them over and over and over again if you're not making changes to the device or to the technology. But obviously we know with cyber, right, the risks are changing all the time, right? Something that was not hackable 2 minutes ago is now, you could have a threat or a vulnerability. So when I'm putting together a plan, what should I be thinking about in terms of retesting?
It's almost like going to the dentist, right? I think you should probably plan to have it retested when you have a multitude of revisions of your software. That's one area you could probably look at and have that documented as when we do retest. The second one is, a systematic, we do it every 6 months or once a year to retest. And from our perspective at Intertech, we would only retest what you've changed in the software. So everything else is static. We would only look at the deltas. That way it becomes far more cost effective to do that testing. Some may want to do a full retest. We've actually had clients who, when we first started doing the testing, they had an unstable operating system that they were operating, and it was a surgical device. Very scary, right? So over the last 2 or 3 years, we've now tested different scenarios, different operating systems, where they come back in and repeat the test because they want to understand the what if scenario when it does occur. So I think fundamentally, if you're monitoring your vulnerabilities on a systematic basis, and you'll see that vulnerabilities actually, there's tools out there. We provide the service as well. We provide a service. We can actually monitor your vulnerabilities every 24 hours once we have them into our database, so that we know when a threat happens, we'll notify you the next day, as opposed to waiting 60 days and you're on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and all all breaks loose at your office. So having the ability to monitor your vulnerabilities and knowing when you have a potential threat, that's also a good time to test. So I would say anywhere from major changes to your software is an absolute must, but also systematically 6 months or every once a year.
So then this all comes down to my vulnerability management plan, right? Like what my plan is for today, tomorrow, 6 months from now, to prevent, as you're saying, right, one of these incidents or issues from coming up where it suddenly becomes, big news that you've had some sort of cybersecurity, what do you call it, a challenge?
When it escalates, it escalates to a threat level, and the threat levels are based on red is the highest threat level. When a known vulnerability goes to a red level, it's a threat.
Awesome. Well, George, I love talking about all of these things. Is there anything else that you think manufacturers should know, especially medical device manufacturers, when they're considering cybersecurity and the challenges that come along with it, or maybe you're a little bit nervous about, getting into this space or the requirements that exist? Yeah,
you asked earlier, Clarissa, it really is the number one question. Where do I begin? And it's never a bad time. It's better to plan for it than plug it in for new product innovation. However, that being stated, getting a snapshot of where you sit today before you start integrating wireless is completely acceptable. And understanding what you have from an architecture perspective, or if your organization has a large acquisitive nature, you would want to know what's in that, because you have to understand that you are now responsible for those devices and the upgrading of the software, not just the operating system, but also the Bluetooth and the patching that's associated with all the Lego bricks, if you would. So always ask the question. And certainly there's ad hoc services or testing services that are available to all manufacturers from their perspective.
Yeah, because I think, right, you have to be thinking about, where you want to go geographically too, right? We didn't really touch on that, but there can be nuances in the requirements, when you're putting together a plan of what's required where.
Yeah, the nuance, that's absolutely. And a lot of the, there's an international document called the IMDRF, which is a really solid document to review, and it has a really good foundational approach towards cybersecurity. And the bulk of, I think, the process end of it is what really gets our clients, from a preparedness perspective. How do I prepare my processes? I don't know how to write the processes. I don't have processes. I'm a brand new startup. I haven't even launched a product yet, right? That's a huge issue. So I think it's understanding the process end of the cybersecurity requirements. And the testing is pretty, it's, if you're testing for a pen test, it's going to be the same pen test because the threat vectors don't change on your device. For the European Union and the FDA, you're attacking the cloud, you're attacking the mobile app, you're attacking Wi-Fi. That's pretty much, tried and true. However, the processes may have some nuances there. That's a key thing to look for. And the differences, there's not 100% overlap between what one country is requiring on a process side and others.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there'll be so many questions that come out of this, and obviously a lot more to come from regulatory agencies and things as we see technology continue to evolve and the regulations continue to evolve. So I'm sure we'll be keeping people posted and up to date, but I really want to thank you, George, so much for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure. This is awesome. Yeah. I love it. Can I come back?
Love chatting. Yes. Anybody, you can come back anytime. Love chatting about cybersecurity and requirements. And thank you to everybody for tuning in and listening with us. You can feel free to reach out and email me with any questions or anything you'd like us to cover. And if you have questions for George, send them my way and I will make sure to get them over to George so we can get them answered for you. Thanks so much, you guys.
Clarissa, thanks so much. I had a great time.
Yes, thanks, George.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.